Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is the next video in the additional skill RPA developer series, and the topic which we are looking is the databases. In the previous videos of the series, we have already covered all of this which you are looking on the screen, right? In case you do not have the Microsoft SQL Server with you on your computer, you can actually watch the first video where we are guiding you step by step that how you can install the Microsoft SQL Server. Apart from that, we have already covered the basics of databases, how you create, insert, retrieve and data in SQL, what is aggregate, what are clauses, comments and operators. In case you are not aware of any of this, the link to this complete playlist is available in the description. Today, we are going to discuss about the constraint. When I say constraint, I simply means which are the constraints which are available in the SQL Server. And this would be our agenda. We are going to start with what exactly are the constraints, what are the common constraints which are available. Today, we are going to see only one constraint, which is the primary key constraint. How do you use the same in queries and in SQL? What happens if you try to add a primary key constraint to a table which is already having data and to a table which is having no or duplicate data? And at the end, we are also going to see what are the important and the crucial properties that you need to make sure when creating the primary key constraint. Okay, so let's get started. To get started with what exactly are constraints? In SQL Server, constraints are simply the rules and the condition that are defined on a table to enforce the data integrity. In other words, let's say I have created a table, right? And I want to create a table for an employee. Now in a company, employee ID cannot be duplicate. No two employees cannot have the same employee ID, which means that I need to make sure that if somebody is trying to insert a duplicate into the employee table, I need to give an error, which means that I have to enforce some rules so that my data is integrated. Let's take another example, right? Let's say I'm creating a database of employees and I am storing some data where we have a field which is called date of birth, right? Now if some employee is coming and he say that I do not have my date of birth, that means that my data becomes inconsistent, right? I do not have a reliable data. So I can make sure that yes, let's make this column as not null. Till the time you provide me a value, I am not going to insert your record, right? So all this such kind of rules, conditions can be enforced on the tables on the column with the help of something which is called constraint, right? Now why do we do that? To maintain the accuracy, consistency and reliability of the data within the database. These are some of the common constraints which are available: primary key, foreign key, unique key, check, default and not null. Today in this tutorial, we are primarily focused on the first one, which is the primary key, because this is the most crucial and the most important one, right? So let's get started by looking at the first one, which is the primary key. Okay, so the first constraint which we are going to see today is the primary key constraint. Now, this constraint is the most common constraint which we are going to use whenever we are creating any table. This simply ensures that you do not have duplicate data in your table. It simply prevents adding duplicate data to your columns. Now, there are some things which you need to remember. The first thing is that your table can only have one primary key constraint. Okay, in a table you cannot have more than one primary keys. To look that as an example, what we are going to do now is we are going to create an employee table. As you can see on the screen, this is a syntax for creating an employee table, right? Where I am creating an employee table, I would be having 5 columns: employee ID, first name, last name, email ID and age, right? All of this is exactly what we have been seeing in the create table. The only difference which you will notice is in the employee ID column. That is where I have written something which is called primary key. Now, while creating the table, whenever we are deciding the columns, wherever I specify this keyword which is called primary key, that would ensure that that column in the table is your primary key, right? So now what does it actually do? This constraint will ensure that the employee ID is unique, which also means that you cannot have duplicate data in the employee ID, right? Let's try to create this table in SQL and see what happens if I actually go and try to insert the duplicate records. Okay, so I am back in my SQL server, right? So I now hope you are able to connect here and you have the UiPath database with you, right? To execute the query, I'll go to the UiPath database and hit on this guy which says new query. And yes, we are in the new query wizard. I'll just copy paste the same query which we have got here. I'll just zoom it, right? So I'll just quickly repeat. We are creating a table which the table name is employee. We need to have these columns here, and this is the data type, right, as we have explained, and this is actually the primary key constraint, which means that primary key now for this table would be employee ID. Okay, I'll quickly check. I do not have the employee table here. I have the products and the temp dv in the tables, right? So I'll go select this and I say execute. Okay, command is completed successfully, right? That means now if I go here and I hit a quick refresh, in the tables we have the employee table created. Okay, once the table is created, now the next thing what I want to do is I want to insert some data into this table, right? So I'll just quickly minimize this. Now to insert the record in the table, we can simply use this insert statement, right? We already have explained the insert statement in detail in the previous video, so not spending much time here. In case you do not understand any one of this, please go and watch the previous video which we have already covered, right? So here I am telling the SQL server that insert into the employee, which is this table just created, right? Employee ID, first name, last name, email and age, these are the same column here, and the value for employee ID I am giving as 1, name, last name, this is the email ID, and this is the age, right? If I go and I say execute, you will notice that one row has been affected, which simply means that this row is now part of the table, right? To validate, I'll simply go here and I say select star from employee. So we have this one John Doe, all this record whichever we just inserted, right? As in the bottom you can see, I'll just pull it a little bit up like this, right? So this is the same record which we have inserted, right? Now here you would notice that now primary key will ensure that now you cannot insert a second employee with this employee ID. Let's try to do that. Instead of John, if let's try to insert a new record where I say Mukeshkala and I say that I'll just try to put one new record, okay, and I'll update my age. Okay, now here if I try to insert this same record, but if you see here everything is different, one is same, right, and one was the primary key. Now what happens if I simply go and execute this? You would notice that you are getting an error which says that you are having a violation of the primary key constraint, which is pk_employee, right? It is telling me that you have a primary key constraint which is on the employee, cannot insert duplicate in the dbo.employee. The duplicate value of the key is 1, right? It is telling me that the value 1 is already available and you are trying to insert. So that is why this statement has been terminated and it is not successful, right? Which simply means that if I go to this table, you would see that I do not have the record. Okay, but if I change this value from 1 to 2 and if I execute it now, this record would be executed successfully, right? So primary key simply means that you cannot have duplicate row of data in a table, right? This would ensure the data accuracy, right? And employee ID for any company cannot be duplicate, right? We cannot have two employees with the same ID. This can be kind of a service ticket, right? Let's say I'm writing a table where I have to store the records of ServiceNow, but ServiceNow tickets number cannot be duplicate, right? So that means that ticket number will now be a primary key, right? So I hope you understand the primary key. I would like to take a pause and I just want you guys to write in the comments that what do you think can be a primary key in any of the scenario, right? One scenario I have already given is that it can be a service ticket in a ServiceNow. just comment me down which other table or which other scenario you think that we can use this primary key. Okay, I'll wait for your comment and let's move forward. Okay, now this time when I created the primary key constraint, I did not have the table, right? So I was creating a fresh table so I could easily add the primary key in front of that thing, right? Now sometime you might have a scenario that the table is already created, but while creating the table somebody forgot or somebody missed to add the primary key constraint, right? Now is it necessary that we always have to define the primary key at the beginning? The answer is no, right? You have an option in SQL where you can actually alter the existing table and you can add the primary key constraint even after you have created the table. But when you do so, you have to take care of certain things. That is what we are going to discuss next. Okay, so let's quickly go to our SQL server and see all of this in action. Okay, so I am back into my SQL server, right? Let's quickly first delete this table, right? So as of now, I have this employee table, select star from employee, right? Let's try to delete this table, right? So how do we delete this table? We simply use drop table employee, execute, and that deletes the table, right? If I select star from employee, you would see that I do not have the employee table available, right? Now what we are going to do next, right? So I'll delete all of this. Let's say I am creating a new table, right? And as you can see here, I do not have the primary key available for the employee ID. This is a plain table. So I go here and I say execute. And the command was completed successfully. If I go here and I say select star from employee like this, right? Now you would see that my table is created and it do not have the primary key constraint. Now, which simply means that now if I try to insert some data into this table, what would happen? It will actually go and insert the duplicates, right? So this is my insert statement, the same one. If I execute it, it says that one row has been affected. Instead of John, if I just put Mukeshkala and I just put it here, again one row has been affected. Let's try to select and select star from employee, right? And you would notice that I have a duplicate here, right? Now just now we discussed that we have a data, we have a table already created. Now if I want to add a primary constraint, can I do that? The answer was yes, right? But what are the things we need to take care while doing that, right? So what I'll do is I'll just copy paste the syntax which we just have, which is this one, right? So the syntax is simple: alter the table name, which is employee, add the constraint. We are discussing about the constraint, right? So add constraint. You have to give the constraint a name, right? What is the name of the constraint? So the name of the constraint is pk underscore employee. This is a naming convention you can follow. You can change it as per your requirement, but this makes sense because pk signifies primary key on the employee table. Then primary key is the keyword and which column, right? So my column is employee ID. So this is the employee ID, right? Now if I execute this, what would happen? SQL will actually go and add a primary key constraint to this table, but we already have duplicates in the table. What would happen? Let's try to execute that, right? So I hope you understood the scenario. We had a table. This table had got 2 record. It do not had the primary key constraint. I am trying to add a primary key constraint, but now I have duplicate records. Let's go here and try to execute. You say that, oh sorry, I forgot this A. I'll again execute and I say execute. And it says that cannot define the primary key constraint on a nullable column on table employee, right? Cannot create constraint or the index, see the previous error. It's not giving me. It's saying that Mukesh, your column is a null column, which means that you can always insert a null, right? Let's try to do that. If I just put a null here and try to execute, it was able to insert a null value. See, null value. So that is what this constraint is telling me. When I execute this one, it says that I am not able to define the constraint because your column is a nullable column, right? And anybody can insert a null in your primary key, so I would not be able to add the value which is having null, right? Now, which means that I need to first fix the problem with the existing table, right? Which means that I have to make this column as not null. Now, how do you make a column not null? That absolutely simple, right? You just have to write this syntax, right? I'm just copying pasting here, right? Alter table employee, which means that alter the table which is employee. In the table, you have a column whose name is employee ID and make it to not null, right? So if I go and if I try to execute this, it says that cannot insert null value into the column employee ID. It already have nulls, right? So these are the things, guys, you need to make sure that when you are adding a constraint, you need to make sure that there are no null values, your column is not null, because otherwise if you do not define the structure at the beginning, these are all the problems you would face, right? And now I am also going to tell you how to resolve that, right? So if you see here, this was null, right? Now what I'm trying to say, I was trying to make this column as primary key, so it tells that you can insert null, right? So I have inserted a null to just validation. Now when I am trying to make it as not null, it's saying me that you already have a null column. If I make it as not null, what will I do with this record, right? So that means that first I need to delete this record, right? So I'll go and I'll say delete the record, right? So I would say this we have discussed, right? How do you delete from the table? Delete from employee where employee ID is equal to null, right? And I say execute. 0 rows affected, that means my syntax is wrong. So the correct syntax would be, no, okay, it's not equal to null, where I would just need to specify is null. Okay, so delete from employee where employee ID is null. I'll just execute this and 1 row is affected, right? Now if I just execute this select statement, okay, the null record is gone. Okay, now can I make this as not null? So I'll just execute this statement, alter table employee, alter this employee ID where it is not null, right? The integer ID, I want to add a constraint. So I'll go and execute this and it says that command has been completed successfully, which means that now I have made the first requirement, which means that my column is not null, right? Now if I try to go and execute this statement where I was trying to insert the null, it says that I cannot insert a null value. That means that it confirms me that my database employee ID column is not null, right? And how do I do that? I just use this statement and made it to not null, right? Now again, my primary objective is still not satisfied. I wanted to make this as primary key, so I'll just execute this statement, which is alter table employee, add a primary key constraint. So let's try to execute it now. Again, I am getting a second error which says that the unique key constraint is terminated because a duplicate key was found. It says that your table already have duplicate keys, right? Since your table has already got some data, right? And both of these data are duplicate and you are telling SQL to make it a primary key, what should I do? Which means that I need to fix this error first, right? So what I'll do is simply, I'll just update this table. Okay, I'll just update the table and I would say set employee ID is equal to 2 where first name is equal to Mukesh, right? So all of this, guys, we have already discussed in the previous session, so I hope you are following along with me. So I'll just execute this. 1 row has been affected and let's try to see the results now. 1 and 2, right? Now can I add the primary constraint? I have made it to not null. I have removed the duplicates as well. Let's try to go and add the alter table, add constraint, right? Execute. Command has been completed successfully, which means that now I was successfully able to add the primary key constraint, right? Let's test that. Instead of null, let's try to execute the null, right? So primary key cannot be null. So we have got an error. I'll try to insert 1. I'll go here and I say execute. Now again I'm getting the same error which says that violation of the primary key. 1 was already there, right? So if I just execute this, you would see 1 was already there. So if I make it to 3 and I say execute, you would notice that one row has been affected, which simply means that now my table would have 3 records, right? Now these are duplicates because we have not set anything here, right? We have just a constraint on the primary key, which is the employee ID, right? So that is the thing which you need to make sure. If your table has already got some data, these are the challenges you might face. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. This is how you actually add a primary key. Alter table employee, add the constraint name, primary key, and the column which you want to make it the constraint, right? Now if your table do not have any data, you are free to always use this statement. The second scenario, you have data but there is no duplicate, then also you can easily add this statement. The third scenario could be you have data but some data is null. So that is the place you have to first make sure that the column you are making primary key should be not null, right? And you have to add a not null check in that column, which means that if you have nulls, you need to remove those, add that null, right? Once that is defined, if your data has got duplicate records still, you need to remove the duplicates. Then only you would be able to alter this table and add a primary key constraint, right? That is why it is always said that whenever you are designing the table, whenever you are designing the database structure, make sure what data or what constraint you want to have. Otherwise, once your data is populated, it becomes a cumbersome task to go and edit all of this. The last thing which I want to discuss about the primary key constraint are its key properties. That whenever we are trying to create a primary key constraints, what are the things we need to take care, or in other words, what are the key properties, right? The first one is uniqueness. A primary key must contain unique values, right? We have already seen that no two rows can have the same value in the primary key. Why do you want to do that? Because it's a primary key and we want the rows to be uniquely defined. Not nullability, which means that a primary key cannot contain null value, right? This also we have seen that when I was trying to make a column which was not null, SQL was not allowing me to create it as a primary key, right? So first I had to add, or I would say I had to change the column to not null, then only you can have the primary key in that column. Which means that if your column is not null, then only you can make it as primary key. This makes sure that your data is integrated and you do not have null records. The next one is single value, which simply means a primary key can consist of one or more columns following a composite key, right? We will talk about composite key in a near future, but just to let you know that in SQL we have a concept where you can actually club multiple columns together and form a composite key. So now if your composite key is acting as a primary key, you need to make sure that the value of two composite keys should not be same, right? Indexing. By default, a primary key creates a clustered index on the table, right? Index we have not discussed, but just you need to remember that by default, the primary key creates the clustered index, which means that efficient storage and retrieval of the data based on the primary key. Meaning that whenever you are writing any query, any statement, let's say select statement, because you have already created a primary key, that would create a clustered index, so your fetching would be more fast, more efficient, because you have indexing which is already defined by the primary key, right? foreign key reference, that is the next kind of constraint which we are going to discuss in the upcoming videos. But a primary key can be referenced as a foreign key in other table, right? So if I have two tables where I want to join them with some common values, primary key can be used as a reference to establish the relationship, right? Last one is maintainability. Primary key help ensure the integrity and consistency of data within that table. It prevents the duplicate, null values, making it easier to manage and update the table, right? These properties of the primary key are crucial for maintaining the uniqueness, data integrity, and establishing the relation with the other tables in a RDBMS, right? I hope now you understand what is RDBMS. Now, when I say establishing relationship, this is a concept of foreign key, which would be the next video in this series, right? So these are the key properties of the primary key. Okay. So with this, we come up to the end. Let's quickly recap, right? Today we have seen that in SQL Server, we have something which is called constraint, that are the rules and conditions which are defined on the table to enforce the data integrity. We have seen one type of constraint, which is the primary key constraint, which simply makes each row of the table as unique. It prevents duplicate, null values. Only one table can have one primary key, and at the end we have seen that what are the key properties of the primary key, right? I hope this was helpful and you were able to gain some insights of the primary key. I would request you guys to go back and practice this same on the table, otherwise you will forget the concept, right? So with this, I would like to wrap this video here. If you have any more questions, any more doubts, your feedback is appreciated. Let me know in the comments, right? So thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do subscribe to the channel, and happy automation.